Aaron. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. I suppose if you're overseas, could be good evening. We're really delighted to be with you. Want to say a word?
Hello, everyone.
This is our first time participating in the extraordinary program of the Orange County CSP. We know of it by reputation. We're deeply impressed by the commitment to continuing education and really thrilled to be part of this this online program. So I'm going to now share my screen and we're going to begin to talk about Kiryas Joel, New York. I assume people can see that. Sharon, is it visible to you? Yep, great. So what we're going to be talking about is our recently published book. It appeared last month, and I should say if anybody's interested in purchasing it, you can do so through Princeton University Press, and there is a discount code, SHTL. So if anyone is interested, you can go to the Princeton University Press website. The title of the book is American Shtetl, and we're really going to spend the bulk of our time unpacking what that title means. I'm going to pick up at the outset by talking about the idea of a shtetl, with which some of you may indeed be familiar. The sort of iconic American representation of the shtetl is in Fiddler on the Roof, focused on a sort of mythic Eastern European community of Anatevka. And I should note, especially at this point in time, that there were many shtetl in the regions of Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, which of course is now subjected to such unrelenting assault. And especially in this month of Adar, when we marbim b'simcha, when we expand and hope to really broaden joy in the world, we really hope for a quick and definitive resolution to this terrible, terrible conflict. So when we think of the shtetl, we think typically of a community that is comprised almost entirely of Jews. Again, like this picture on the left from Fiddler on the Roof. A community that adheres to a single traditional way of life that consists exclusively of Jews and that sort of operates in a kind of time warp. What we know is that the shtetl of Eastern Europe, those that existed on the map that I showed you and in other places in Eastern and East Central Europe, were often very different than that. They weren't comprised of a completely homogeneous group of Jews. They weren't comprised of people who adhered to a single religious or, for that matter, political line. They weren't comprised of people of a single socioeconomic class, but there was tremendous diversity within the shtetl of Eastern Europe. And in fact, it oftentimes was part of an existing town or city that was not Jewish in its demographic base. So what we have inherited is really a mythic idea of what the shtetl is as a homogeneous, deeply traditional community. And it's important to add one other point about sort of the actual shtetl of Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. Never was a shtetl in Eastern Europe accorded the power of government. Never was a shtetl in Europe made into a legally recognized municipality. And the reason we are belaboring this point about sort of the mythic shtetl and comparing it to the actual shtetl on the ground is because, in fact, what we are about to discuss comes as close to the model of the mythic shtetl, rather than the sort of the historical shtetl, as perhaps has ever been the case in Jewish history. And that is in the form of this community, Kiryas Joel, New York. The question we ask, how could it be that such a community that sort of hews to that outline of the mythic shtetl could take rise in America? And the answer to our question is it really could only take rise in America. And that's what we want to sort of impart to you, that kind of irony that precisely in America, right, liberal, secular America, is where this mythic form of a shtetl took rise. So let's begin just by introducing the subject. Kiryas Joel, or Kiryas Joel, I'll also refer to it as KJ, is a community today of some 33,000 Satmar Hasidim, that is to say, followers of the Hasidic dynasty that has become the largest in the world. It is not just a group of Satmar Hasidim, it is a legally recognized municipality in Orange County, New York, that adheres to a very distinctive way of life. It is a community comprised entirely of Satmar Hasidic Jews, so it achieves a degree of homogeneity that the Shtetl of yore did not possess. It is, by its own aspirations and self-definition, a self-segregated enclave, a spiritual enclave, an enclave of spiritual purity, that really promotes its own distinctive view of operating the world that is perhaps best represented in the welcome sign that you see on the right, that calls upon all visitors to the community to respect the modesty norms of the community, especially in dress, but also in speech. Very much consistent with sort of the separate spheres gender ideology of the community, a community that imagines that women have very specific roles, largely, but not exclusively consigned to the domestic sphere, and men a much different set of roles, often taking place in the public domain. What is really important to emphasize is this is not just a community of like-minded religious Jews. It is also a legally recognized municipality, what we call a form of local sovereignty. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with this, that as a result of sort of years of tensions with local officials in the town of which Kiryas Joel was part, namely the town of Monroe, in 2019, a deal was brokered whereby Kiryas Joel exited the town of Monroe and became the town of Palm Tree. Palm Tree and Kiryas Joel are completely coterminous. What that move afforded was a degree of liberation for residents of Kiryas Joel from remaining restrictions or regulations imposed by the town of Monroe upon Kiryas Joel. Okay, the community we're talking about is about 50 miles north of New York City, in Orange County, as I mentioned. For many New Yorkers, that constitutes upstate. If you're in Syracuse, it doesn't really represent upstate, but we think of it as upstate as a result of our New York City-based orientation. The community is named after, and in fact was created in the image of this person, the founding rabbi of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, Reb Yoelish, born not in Ukraine, but in what was the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Hungary, the Kingdom of Hungary, which was one of the most important incubators of that form of traditionalist Judaism that we call Haredi Judaism. The Teitelbaum family was a family that belonged to the Hasidic brand of Orthodox Judaism, and it was really distinguished by its commitment to fight for stringent observance of the law and to combat forms of impurity that the world, and particularly the modern world, was filled with. There's a very powerful sense of the obligation to engage in struggle and tension and even combat to achieve a degree of spiritual purity. It's interesting, and some of you may be familiar with this fact, that for Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, by his own declaration, the chief form of spiritual impurity in the world was actually Zionism. Zionism, which to his mind sought to force the process of return to the Holy Land in advance of the Messianic era, in a certain sense sought to assert for itself what was clearly a divine prerogative. That is, there was God's choice when to commence the Messianic process, but Zionism sought to trigger that process before, and therefore, really, in his book, was a grave transgression of Jewish law and the divine order. Rabbi Teitelbaum was raised as I mentioned, in Hungary, in the northeast quadrant of Hungary, hotbed to Haredi and Hasidic Judaism. and held a number of rabbinic posts. It's important to note that after the First World War, and particularly the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, much of Hungary was chopped up into different new states like Czechoslovakia, Ukraine for a brief spell, and Romania. And in fact, the town for which he would gain his greatest renown, Satmar in Hungary, or Satu in Romania, fell into under the control of the Romanian authorities after 1920. This is significant because in 1928, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum was elected town rabbi of Satmar, because of that sort of distinctive Teitelbaum way, because of the degree of stringency that he insisted on, the extent to which he required adherence to halakha, to Jewish law, there was considerable resistance to his appointment. And he decided that he would not immediately accept the position as town rabbi in Satu. It was, in fact, only 6 years later, in 1934, that he decided to come to that town to serve as rabbi, after sort of the opposition had dissipated. What's important to note is that he and his flock in Satmar only dwelt there in peace, as it were, for 10 years, because it was in 1944 that Nazi forces invaded Hungary, breaking an arrangement that the Hungarian leader Admiral Horthy had with Adolf Hitler, and basically within a matter of 3 or 4 months, 3/4 of the community of Satu and surrounding regions had been deported to concentration and death camps. Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, in a twist of irony, was not deported. He was rescued, as it were, as part of a transport out of Hungary by a leading Romanian Zionist official by the name of Rudolf Kastner, something for which some in the world never forgave Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum because of his fierce anti-Zionist position. But he himself survived, made his way along with 1,684 other members of the Kastner transport to the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, and then in early December 1944 to Switzerland. He then moved from Switzerland in August 1945 to Palestine to be part of the traditionalist Haredi community there. And a year later, he made his way to the United States, arriving on Rosh Hashanah in September 1946. Rabbi Teitelbaum, in many respects, realized his vision of creating a world of spiritual purity in the United States. He did so initially by sort of pulling together the tattered fragments of the survivor community in New York, and more particularly in Brooklyn, and more particularly in the neighborhood of Williamsburg, which already had a significant Orthodox population, but not what it would become under the influence of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. But at the same time that he settled in Williamsburg and set out to really recreate his community, and more importantly, consistent with my opening remarks, create a new an enclave of purity, he decided that it was also important to seek out a place at a remove from the city, at a remove from the seductions and allures of New York City, that could really serve the purpose of a segregated community where Satmar Hasidim could follow, without interference, their preferred way of life, which was often articulated as Derech Yisrael Sava, the path of the ancient Israel. And so as he was setting up his community in Williamsburg, he also entrusted the task to his chief aides to find an area outside of the city that would be more isolated, that could serve the purposes of being a spiritual enclave. And it's important to note that this quest to find a place outside of the city coincided with a massive transfer of Americans from urban to suburban areas. And this is one of the ways, sort of an early intimation of the way in which the Satmar community and Kiryas Joel are a decidedly American story. So the early attempts to find an enclave or a shtetl actually first began in Staten Island, which at that time did not have a bridge connecting it to other boroughs in New York City. Those efforts took place in the early 1950s and did not reach fruition. The next major effort was the attempt to purchase land in Mount Olive, New Jersey, which seemed quite promising. But when town officials understood that they would likely have a massive influx of strange-looking, to them, Hasidic Jews, they pulled back and retracted the sales of land, leading to litigation that you can see reflected here in this New York Times article. Later in the 1960s, efforts were made to purchase land in Mount Kisco, New York, Conjur's Lake in the late 60s and early 70s. In all of those instances, the Satmar Hasidim who made their way to the suburban and rural parts of the New York metropolitan area often encountered hostility. It turns out that land sellers weren't particularly interested in selling land to Hasidic Jews, whom they deemed to be foreign-looking, foreign-speaking, and alien. And as a result of that, Rabbi Teitelbaum's aides got wiser, and they found someone who could serve as the front man for their efforts to purchase land, a man by the name of Oscar Fisher, who was the brother-in-law of one of the chief aides of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, a man named Leibush Lefkowitz, who became the first mayor of Kiryas Joel. Lefkowitz's brother-in-law, Oscar Fisher, was not a traditionally observant Jew. He did not have a beard. He did not self-identify as Haredi, and he was the person who purchased land for the community in Orange County, New York, in the town of Monroe, beginning in 1972. 2 years of building a development within the town of Monroe took place. 25 single-family homes, 80 garden apartments were built between 1972 and 1974. In the summer of 1974, the sort of secretive nature of the building project, the veil was lifted, and Satmar Hasidim began to move from Brooklyn to Kiryas Joel, to this new community, which was really just a neighborhood of the town of Monroe, to settle. There had been an attempt after the failed efforts to purchase land to keep things secret, and by the spring of 1974, the veil of secrecy began to be lifted, but it was fully lifted in the summer of 1974 with the arrival of the first residents of Satmar residents of Kiryas Joel. Now, part of what's so interesting in this story is not just the attempt to carve out a shtetl, which was indeed the aspiration of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, but the rapidity with which a private association of landowners can become a public entity. All that's required, as you see on the right, with this statute included in the local government handbook, all you basically need is 500 residents of a resident of a village of an existing town who desire to carve out a village that can't be too large. It can't be more than 5 square miles. If you have the assent of those 500 residents, you are 2/3 of the way toward achieving a form of local sovereignty, creating a village as part of a town. And that's in fact what happened, especially because in the years following the arrival of the first Satmar residents in 1974, very contentious disagreements, especially over zoning, ensued between the Satmar residents and town officials and residents of Monroe, culminating in a sort of degree of acrimony in October 1976 that almost led to litigation, a religious discrimination lawsuit in a federal district court in New York. To forestall that, after a series of late-night meetings, it was agreed to allow this neighborhood of the town of Monroe to become a village within a town, but which accorded that village the right to oversee its own zoning regulations. And if we really trace the arc of that development from the incorporation of Kiryas Joel in March 1977 as a legally recognized village until the present, there are many markers of success. It has been, in many ways, an astonishing success. First and foremost, in its demographic growth. So you see here on the left that the community first registered 2,000 residents in 1980. In the latest census, 40 years later, 33,000 residents. So the last decade experienced a 60% growth, and estimates range that by 2040 there could be between 80 and 150,000 residents of Kiryas Joel. Another mark of success is the degree of homogeneity that the community entails. More than 99%. There are handfuls of workers who have established residence in Kiryas Joel, but other than that, the entire community consists of Satmar Hasidic Jews. The lingua franca of the community is Yiddish. It is a cradle-to-grave Yiddish-speaking society. We know this because on the latest census data, we learned that 96% of the community describe themselves as speaking a language other than English in the home. It's also a success not only in creating that Yiddish-speaking world, but in assuring the norms of education that are so central to the community. And what that means is not only that kids in the educational system should be accorded full exposure to Jewish religious subjects, but that they should be prevented or should be discouraged from going to the secular educational world. Fewer than 7.5% of residents in Kiryas Joel have a bachelor's degree at a university, which is in so many ways the inverse of the profile of the rest of the American Jewish community. One of the ways in which Kiryas Joel is very different from the rest of the American Jewish community, but at the same time, we would argue, still very American in many ways that we'll discuss further. Another mark of success in sort of allowing Kiryas Joel to realize Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum's vision of creating this spiritual enclave is the pervasiveness of the modesty norms in the community as reflected in that sign that greets visitors, but in so many other ways within the community, and which is regulated by a semi-official Vadatnias or modesty committee, where Kiryas Joel, according to some, but not all within the community, also marks a success is in its ability to have created a legally recognized municipality. And on that point, there is division within the community, which we'll talk about. But it is impressive to note that this is a community that is, in some sense, transitioned from being a shtetl to a village and now a town. And that means it has its own self-regulating governmental bodies, including a mayor, a village board, and a school board, because it has a public school district, a public school in its midst, which we will talk about in just a minute. We might say this is decidedly and spectacularly un-American, but we want to call your attention to the fact that what we call religious communitarianism, and not state-sponsored religious communitarianism, but religious communitarianism from the bottom up, by which we mean strong forms of religious community taking rise on the legal and political landscape of this country, not just surviving, but flourishing. This is part of the history of the United States, extending back to the formative European arrivals to this country, who established the Massachusetts Bay Company, and whose leader, John Winthrop, declared the ideal of creating a city on the hill, its own form of inspired spiritual enclave. Perhaps the greatest, the most successful example of this kind of religious communitarianism is the case of the Mormons, who first established a municipality of their own in Nauvoo, Illinois, and then as a result of tension with local and federal forces were pushed westward into the territory of Utah, where they established a new stronghold in Salt Lake City and eventually went on to basically create a state of their own. We know of other such examples, including a legally recognized city for a brief spell established in the 1980s in the state of Oregon, in a rural part of that state, by a group of followers of an Indian guru that was called Rajneeshpuram. We also know that there are other examples, along with Kiryas Joel, of Hasidic municipalities in the United States. there was a very interesting, there is a preceding community, a precedent that was already established by a group of Hasidim, Sfera Hasidim, who came from a region now occupied by the state of the Republic of Ukraine, who established their own legally recognized municipality in 1961, after moving out 7 years earlier to Rockland County, New York, to the town of Ramapo. And they, as a result of tensions over zoning, sort of set the precedent by creating their own legally recognized municipality. Similarly, a group of Vizhnitz Hasidim did so also in the town of Ramapo in a community called Keser. These communities are analogous to Kiryas Joel, but do not possess sort of the, in a certain sense, imperial vision and aspiration of Satmar Hasidim, who have a sense of obligation in really growing in order to repopulate their ranks that were so decimated by the Holocaust. So there are about 9,000 Jews in New Square, under 5,000 in Keser, and 33,000 in Kiryas Joel. I'm just going to wrap up before handing things over to Nomi by juxtaposing those markers of success that we discussed with some of the very real troubles that the community has faced. And the deepest trouble it faced was really the loss of its founding Rebbe, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, in August 1979. It was he who really animated the Satmar Hasidic community, and his death left a yawning gap, a void that has not been filled to this day. He left behind no successors, no heirs, never had any boys, did have 3 daughters with a previous wife, with his first wife. But the person who succeeded him, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, his nephew, never succeeded in achieving the degree of legitimacy that Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum had. And in fact, the second wife of the original rabbi, the Rebbitzin, known as Alta Feiga, was herself someone who had a good deal of contempt for the second Satmar Rebbe. And in fact, around the Rebbitzin, there congregated a group of followers of the original Rebbe who never accepted the authority of the second Satmar Rebbe. They became known as the sons of Joel, B'nai Joel, or B'nai Joel, depending on your pronunciation. And this was just one of the important fissures that developed within the community. They became the original group of dissidents. A second major fissure occurred in the community when Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum decided in 1999 essentially to divide the Satmar Empire into 2, granting Kiryas Joel to his son, Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum, and Williamsburg, the other major capital of the Satmar world, to his third son, Zalman Leib. So the succession travails of the community have existed really from 1979 until now. There have been many instances in which these tensions have been addressed within the community, and many instances in which they have been addressed outside of the community, including in the Gentile court system, the secular court system, which we will now discuss in greater detail. I'm going to turn things over now to Nomi.
Hello, everybody. Really good to be with you and to share this story that has gripped us for literally decades. So David has told the story of the Satmars and set it in the broader context of Jewish history and going back to the experience of European Jewry. But the Satmar story is as much an American story as it is a Jewish story. And as such, as an American story, it's also very much a legal story, as represented by this final slide, which has title pages from 2 of the almost literally innumerable lawsuits in which the Satmars of Kiryas Joel became ensnared. But before I address the specifics of these lawsuits, I want to put the tale of the Satmar village in the context of the changes that were occurring in American society just when the village was being formed, right? That is to say, the early to mid to late 70s, and in the early years of its existence, the first half of the 1980s. And there are two changes in particular that proved to be particularly influential and, from the Satmar point of view, propitious for their separatist project. The first is a retreat from integrationism. By integrationism, I mean the familiar concept that everyone, regardless of race, creed, or color, should be integrated into the same workplaces, political, economic, social, and above all, educational institutions. Now, in hindsight, I think we can see that the period of time in which that ideal of integrationism was regnant, was really dominant, was actually pretty short-lived. It commenced, as I think most of you know, with the 1954 decision of Brown versus Board, which was immediately greeted with widespread resistance, not only from white segregationists and a broader population of white parents who objected to busing and other strategies of desegregation of the schools, but also from Black nationalists who perceived early on that desegregation would prove to be what was later called a hollow hope. So by the mid-1970s, when the Satmar project of settling in the town of Monroe was just getting off the ground, the proposition enshrined in Brown versus Board and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the proposition that separate is inherently unequal and unconstitutional was being roundly rejected by various groups on both the right and the left, as expressed in the increasing popularity of philosophies like communitarianism and multiculturalism. So that's one of the two key changes I want to bring to your attention. The second major shift in American political and legal culture that proved to be propitious for the Satmars was a retreat from another core principle of American liberalism, namely the principle of separation between church and state, or to put it more ecumenically, separation between the state and religion. That principle, too, was, perhaps surprisingly, of relatively recent vintage, at least insofar as it was embraced by the courts and by public policy makers, and more specifically insofar as it was understood to require the removal of religion from the public square, and more specifically from public schools, and the denial of public funding to private religious schools. Those two axioms were the products of mid-20th century Supreme Court decisions, which sparked a backlash, a political backlash, that was, I would say, at least as intense, though certainly no more intense, than the resistance to racial desegregation. Indeed, the school prayer decisions that were handed down by the Supreme Court in the early 1960s were the catalyst, a decade before Roe versus Wade, that brought about the coalition of conservative Catholics and Protestant evangelicals that first emerged under the self-bestowed title of the moral majority as a major force in American politics by the late 1970s. But that conservative Christian political coalition was already mobilizing in the mid-1970s, indeed beginning to mobilize in the 1960s, when this Satmar project of creating a satellite in the suburbs was first being implemented. That view, that is to say, the religious rights view, repudiating view of the principle of separation between religion and state, was clearly expressed in many quarters, perhaps most notably by William Rehnquist, who became the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in 1986, but had been an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court since 1972. In the case of Wallace v. Jaffrey, which was yet another school prayer case in which a still liberal Supreme Court majority held that a law requiring public school teachers to conduct religious prayer services and other religious activities in the classroom was unconstitutional, then Justice Rehnquist wrote a dissenting opinion in which he stated, quote, "The wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, which has proved useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned," thus giving voice to what had become an article of faith of the conservative legal movement, which was gaining steam at this very point in time. Now, I want to be clear, the Satmars did not necessarily share the outlook of Christian conservatives, nor of the broader conservative movement, of which the religious right was becoming a key part. To be sure, they shared with conservative Christians their desire for public funding and other forms of state support for religious schools. And they shared their more general antipathy towards loose sexual morals and the growing secularization of society. And it's fair to say that they were also broadly supportive of the conservative movement's business-friendly policies. But they by no means shared that business wing of the conservative movement's ideological commitment to libertarianism and opposition to the welfare state, far from it. And they generally kept their distance from the movement, even as they welcomed its support. That is to say, the Satmar community's alliance with the Christian right and the conservative legal and political movement more broadly, such as it was for most of its history, instrumentalist and not ideological in nature. The Satmars benefited from the erosion of the commitment to the ideals of integration and strict separation between religion and state, which was occurring in response to the ascendance of the American conservative political movement, but they didn't share its ideology, at least until recently, which is something we can talk about during the Q&A. Now, we can see how the Satmars benefited from these changes in American society more broadly in the myriad court cases that the Satmars were drawn into, starting in the 1980s, which is to say just a few short years after the village was formed. Truth be told, the Satmars ended up becoming entangled in so many court cases, it literally defies summary, and it took me literally years to untangle the tangled skein of litigation. So I'm going to describe just two. I hope I have time to describe both of them, at least one, which provide a window into these changes that were occurring in American law, which provided the Satmars with a legal justification for their religious separatist political institutions, those forms of local sovereignty, specifically embodied in a legally recognized village, a municipality, a public housing authority, and a public school district. But those lawsuits, two of which are represented here, also show that American society was internally divided, as was the society of the Satmars inside Kiryas Joel, specifically with respect to the question of the justifiability of a Satmar village. So the first of these cases that I will undertake to summarize, although this opinion that was handed down by the United States Supreme Court in 1994 was only the midpoint of litigation that lasted for nearly 10 years, the entire decade of the 1990s, commencing in 1990, not ending until 1999, which itself was preceded by an earlier round of litigation. All of this litigation concerned the question of special education, a seemingly marginal issue pertaining to a seemingly marginal population, children with special needs inside the community, who at the time this legal controversy began in the mid-1980s numbered about a dozen. And yet this issue pertaining to children with special needs turned out to have an enormous influence on the evolution of the village and the nature of its relations with the outside world. The issue that sparked all of this decade and a half of controversy arose when Congress passed a law in 1975, one of the first victories of the disability rights movement, guaranteeing special educational services to every child with special needs, and creating a structure of funding and implementation that placed upon states, which in turn placed upon local school districts, the obligation to provide and pay for appropriate educational services individually tailored to meet children's special needs, regardless of whether those children attended public schools. Every child in the jurisdiction of a public school district is owed those publicly funded and publicly administered services. And this created a dilemma, not just for the Satmars, but for all parochial school communities. Namely, was it constitutionally permissible, or was it rather a violation of the principle of separation of church and state that many contra Justice Rehnquist believed was embodied in what we call the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? Would it violate that principle for public school districts to provide special educational services to children in private parochial schools? Perhaps so. But then it would seem to logically follow that all children with special needs would be constitutionally obligated to attend public schools, which would violate another well-established principle, going back to court cases in the early 20th century, when the Supreme Court said very definitively that the guarantee of liberty, including the guarantee of religious liberty, meant that all parents have a right to opt out of public schooling and send their children to receive a religious education in private schools. So there was a real dilemma here that's never been definitively resolved. The Supreme Court flip-flopped. In 1985, it held that it was impermissible for the state and public school districts to provide special educational services to children inside parochial schools. 12 years later, the Supreme Court overruled that decision. But in the interim, the community needed to figure out what to do. Against the strenuous objections of the regional public school district, they sought and ultimately succeeded in getting the state of New York to pass a special law authorizing the creation of a separate school district within the confines of the village. A school district that would establish a public school that would only serve children with special needs, that would have a completely secular curriculum, but which would not require the children to leave the community, and therefore which could be provided in an environment that was more culturally and linguistically compatible with their community. That is the law whose constitutionality was challenged, which made its way to the United States Supreme Court in 1994. A very curious and interesting man by the name of Louis Grummet initiated this lawsuit and remained committed to fighting for the dissolution of the law that authorized the creation of a school district in Kiryas Joel. And in 1994, it might have appeared like he won. The Supreme Court agreed with his position that Chapter 748, the official name of the law authorizing the creation of the Kiryas Joel School District, was unconstitutional because it violated the Establishment Clause. But in point of fact, the victory was, we might say, Pyrrhic, because the theory of the case that prevailed did not maintain that it was unconstitutional for the Satmars to have their own public school district. It did not maintain that there was anything inherently unconstitutional about there being a school district within the confines of the village of Kiryas Joel. Quite to the contrary, the theory of the case that prevailed was that every religiously homogeneous community had an equal right to establish its own separate public school district if it so choose. And therefore, the defect, the constitutional defect with Chapter 748 was not that it authorized a religiously homogeneous community to opt out of the regional school district and establish its own separate school district, but rather that it singled out one and only one religious community, namely the Satmars of Kiryas Joel, for this benefit. So long story short, at the end of the day, the Kiryas Joel School District, despite this holding in 1994, has been permitted and has continued to exist from the day it opened its doors in 1990. Now, there's a second, not just single lawsuit, but endless series of lawsuits that are in some ways even more fascinating, which commenced at the same time, one of which is represented on the right-hand side of this slide. And these are lawsuits that were brought not by an outsider challenging the constitutionality of the village, but by the internal dissidents that David alluded to. At the very same time that the controversy over special education was developing in the 1980s, so too, as David has indicated, dissent over the succession to the Rebbe was hardening and expanding into a full-blown dissident movement. And the dissident movement, starting in 1990, has brought innumerable lawsuits, beginning with relatively small bore claims, such as disputing the issuance of citations against dissidents for construction projects, that then expanded and morphed into allegations of systemic discrimination being perpetrated against the dissidents on the part of the village. And that theory of systemic discrimination, you should hear echoes here of the notion of systemic discrimination developed in the context of race discrimination cases, in turn morphed into the claim that brought by Satmars, right? Brought by the dissident Satmars inside Kiryas Joel, who alleged in this and previous and later lawsuits that the village was a theocracy that violated the principle of separation of church and state, and that therefore the court must dissolve it. That claim, too, came very close to success in a dramatic trial that unfolded in a very suspenseful fashion. And we don't know if the court, if the judge presiding over that trial, interestingly, you may recognize the name of that judge, Jed Rakoff, most recently in the news for presiding over a very curious decision relating to Sarah Palin's libel suit against the New York Times, known earlier for presiding over the SEC settlement in the wake of the 2008 financial collapse, that then newly appointed judge made statements on the bench that indicated his receptivity to the theory that the way in which the village was being run indicated a subordination of secular law to religious law and the religious and more specifically separatist objectives to the community, which the judge indicated he might well agree constituted a violation of separation of church and state. But we will never know what he would actually have decided, how he would have resolved that issue, because the signs that he was receptive to that challenge and that he might be ready to order the dissolution of the village led to a settlement agreement. As the lawyers representing the village and the village leaders themselves induced the dissidents to agree to a settlement. The dissidents perhaps could have or should have pushed forward with their claim. Perhaps they would have attained a victory, but for reasons we can only surmise about, they pulled back from the brink. They agreed to settle the case, and they soon came to regret that decision, and so they brought subsequent decisions renewing their claim that the village is a theocracy. But in each and every subsequent case, as the one here, the court, presided over by Judge Rakoff, found that the new lawsuit was barred by res judicata, which is just a Latin legal term for this issue has already been resolved. It's been resolved by the private settlement, and you're not allowed to relitigate the same case once again. What does all this tell us? It tells us many things, but perhaps one of the most curious and striking facts on which we will lead you is the dependence of the Satmars and their continual reliance on and resorts to American courts and American law to defend themselves against challenges and to further their objectives, notwithstanding their professed commitment to the principle that internal disputes should never be brought to Gentile courts. That principle has been honored in the breach more times than we can tell. And we would be very happy to ruminate about why that principle of separatism has been violated so many times over, and what that tells us both about the nature of the Satmar's separatist project and the nature of American society in which this drama has unfolded.
Thank you so very much. That was amazing. And there are a lot of people are saying just that. We don't have a lot of time, but a couple of questions, they sort of group together in a variety of ways. But the first one, which is also curious to me, is the funding for all of this. You mentioned that 7% have BAs, right? There needs to be a tax base to pay for the school system, to pay for the special education system. They needed to have hired people to come up with these brilliant legal arguments. I mean, these are amazing arguments. So, where does the money come from?
Right. So there are, I think, three buckets of money that we can think of. First, this is a community that works. Unlike some Haredi and Hasidic groups, men in the community are enjoined to work. They're called upon to study before they go to work and after they come to work. But Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum made clear that men should work. An increasing number of women also work as a result of what we call a process of unwitting assimilation to American, not just legal and political, but also social norms. So people work. About 25% of the community commutes to New York or New Jersey. The largest number of people are actually employed within the private educational system in the community, which is a monumental operation. There are 3 educational systems, each of which is attached to one of the camps in town, the mainstream camp of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, the camp belonging to his followers of his brother, Rabbi Zalman Leib, and then the B'nai Yoel, the original group of dissidents who have developed their own system. So that's a huge employer. People are also employed in various small businesses and crafts in Kiryas Joel and the town of Monroe and surrounding areas. One sort of new domain of employment that's become popular is third-party resale of online resale, which requires constant connection to the internet, which raises all sorts of interesting cultural and religious challenges, given that one should use the internet, according to religious authorities in this community, only for reasons of economic sustenance, and sometimes it bleeds over into other activities. So employment within the community, but it's important to note that people do not earn large salaries that can support the extremely large families they have. Once upon a time, in the 2010 census, Kiryas Joel was the poorest community in America, with
I was going to ask about that.
over 60% of the people, residents below the poverty line. That's dropped to 45%, which really reflects a growing process of sort of embourgeoisement of more and more people entering the middle class as a result of employment. So employment within the community is the first source. The second is the very extensive network of charity that the Satmar community has established. There are a number of extremely wealthy Satmar Hasidim who have been benefactors of the community for decades. And there's really a deeply felt communal imperative to share your wealth. You needn't be wealthy in order to be part of that. If your neighbor next door has to marry off a child and does not have enough money to do so honorably, it's your obligation to support. If we scale that up to some of the major donors of the Satmar community, this creates a very extensive charitable network. And the third bucket, in addition to employment and charity, is government support at state and federal levels. This is a community that receives a very large percentage, a very large amount has received traditionally and continues to receive a great deal of state and federal support. And some might say, well, that's because, this is a group that, is unwilling to work and completely abandons its obligations to society. And that is indeed one way to look at it. We see the success of the Satmar community in gaining government support as really part of its ability to play the game of interest group politics in America extraordinarily well. They've managed to marshal their homogeneity, and particularly their ability to marshal strength around election time in the form of block votes into a very substantial political asset that can bring with it tangible economic benefits. So these are
they're able to sort of straddle that psychological divide, which Nomi, you mentioned, of we're separate when we want to be separate, but we want to take from the secular font when that serves us as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between different forms of interaction with the outside world. So the most threatening form of interaction from the standpoint of this community is culture. They want to resist change in their belief system and their practices. So any form of contact that would tempt people away, give them ideas, or erode the norms of the community, in and of itself, receiving a subsidy to pay for your rent in affordable housing does not carry that threat. So that by itself, there's not necessarily either any cognitive dissonance there or any contradiction there, right? Because this is, as I said in my remarks, this is not a community that is ideologically opposed to a welfare state, far from it. But there are other, the question is really more with regard not to their receipt of funds, which I think is more of an issue for the outside community and the people's ambivalence about supporting people with ways they disapprove of. But can their interactions with politicians and can their participation in lawsuits avoid becoming a kind of filter through which different habits of thought, different cultural outlooks enter into the community. And that, along with, of course, the internet and some other interesting sort of portals, carry the threat of cultural exposure, which is a real issue for the community.
Well, on that note, I'm going to have to say thank you. We're at almost 10 after 2, and this has been absolutely fascinating. And there are many, many more questions. And I know that Ari is going to have you back. So there'll be some other time to answer some of them and explore this in greater depth. So again, if you could just give us the discount code for the book so that if people want to get it. And as I said, I read it. It's fascinating because this is a story that is, thank you. It's in the chat now, SHTL at Princeton University Press. It's a story that is fascinating, scary, and brilliant all at the same time. So thank you very much. We've all enjoyed it. And thank you to everybody else. And we hope to see you this week at other CSP events.
Thank you so
much. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.